where common sense meets enlightenment. Conversations around mind, body, and spirit. Each month, a group of wellness thought leaders assemble to discuss topics like rage, wisdom in the 21st century, our mental chatter, and how to build healthy relationships.
Good evening, wisdom seekers. You're listening to the Wisdom Track podcast from the British Association of Anger Management, or BAM for short. The Wisdom Track is where we take a closer look at BAM's core values of growing self-knowledge, honing emotional intelligence, and learning communication skills. You can find us over at angermanage.co.uk and under the Wisdom Track on Apple Podcasts and YouTube. My name is Steve Bill. I am a journalist who has undertaken the BAM program. Could we maybe put ourselves on mute, everybody? Marvelous, thank you. So sorry, my name is Steve Bill. I get to say that again. And I'm a journalist who's undertaken the BAM program. And if you too would like to join one of our acclaimed anger management courses as seen in the Sunday Times, the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail, Stylist magazine, and pretty much everywhere else, then there is our 2-hour live online introduction to anger management on Thursday, March the 10th at 7 p.m. We have our live online group course beginning again on Tuesday, the 15th of March. And we have an in-person group weekend course happening just outside London on the 25th to the 27th of March. Again, you can head over to angermanage.co.uk for details on those. Mike Fisher and Craig Snake Bloomstrand from BAM are with us today talking about mending relationships, or rupture and repair, as psychotherapists call it. And if you've got a temper on you, or you get into regular tussles with your colleagues or social circle, or maybe on social media, then it's a skill you're likely to benefit from. So, hey, Mike, hey, Snake, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Steve.
Glad to be here.
Snake, as you do for all of our Zoomcasts, you've written a column on the subject of rupture and repair. And it's at the top of our news blog, angermanage.co.uk. right now. If anyone wants to go over and take a look, there'll be a link in the podcast description. If you're not watching live, you're watching later. So Snake, maybe you could tell the listeners what rupture and repair is and what your take on it is.
Yeah, the inspiration for that particular article actually was Michael and I talking about clients that we've been seeing and how much rupture and repair is in the world right now. I needn't go into the politics, the economics, the social upheaval, quarantine for 2 years. Our comfort zone as human beings, our status quo, has really been upset in the last many years. And what we see from clients, both through the anger management as well as the work that I do, is people deep into their lives having been ruptured and not real clear on how to do a repair. And so I thought the focus of that might be worth exploring. And once I got into it, my head pretty much exploded because I started seeing rupture and repair pretty much everywhere. Generally, the concept is thought to speak about intimate relationships, conflict within intimate relationships, and how to reconcile them. We went a little bit bigger from the standpoint of it's a common human experience that happens everywhere, whether it's your car, your relationship, a job. when the status quo gets upset, what then? And how do we deal with it? And so we're going to explore that a bit today from a bunch of different standpoints. And obviously, the primary interest is in intimate relationships, and the pressure, because of everything I've spoken about. There's families that are really at each other at the moment because they've had a little too much togetherness. Dealing with the way the world works right now is putting a lot of pressure on a lot of different people. And to have a better picture of rupture and repair can only help. So I think it'd be wise for Michael to say some about Gottman's work and the classical sense, and then we'll broaden what we mean by rupture and repair and deepen it a bit.
And that's Dr. John Gottman of the Gottman method, right? Which is mostly for couples therapy, which you're trained in, right, Mike? And you use in your therapy.
Yeah. So I'll tell you what I'd like to do. What a beautiful introduction, Snake. That was very, very, very meaningful. What I'd like to do, and I'll certainly get on to Gottman, but what I wouldn't mind doing is I found a quote a couple of weeks ago, and it completely blew me away because it felt like it was so suitable for this particular conversation we're having this afternoon. It's by a woman by the name of Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote the book Eat, Pray, Love. And this is how it goes. So this is what we are like collectively as a species. This is our emotional landscape. I met an old lady once, almost 100 years old, and she told me there are only two questions that human beings have ever fought over all through history. How much do you love me? It's the first one. And the second one is, who's in charge? Everything else is somehow manageable, but these two questions of love and control undo us all, trip us over and cause war, grief, and suffering. And it's an interesting quote, especially when you think about what's actually happening between Russia and Ukraine. How much do you love me? And what was the other one?
Who's in charge?
Who's in charge? And I find that absolutely fascinating. But coming over to John Gottman, he talks about the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And what he describes is that's the first four components of the work before people are even 15 or 20 minutes into the first assessment or interview. So what he's listening out for, he's listening out for criticism, he's listening out for stonewalling, he's listening out for contempt, and he's listening out for defensiveness. And he says, when a couple present those four horsemen, it does mean that the relationship is on the rocks. However, what is very beautiful about his work is that there are also antidotes to each of those four horsemen. So just let me very quickly repeat them. There's contempt, there's criticism, there's defensiveness, and then there are stonewalling. And how do we deal with it? And so I think part of the conversation we're having this afternoon is being able to address that within the context of rupture and repair.
So what gets in the way of rupture and repair? I mean, you just mentioned contempt, offensive, etc. But what kind of stops us from initiating repair?
Speaking for myself, defensiveness is a big component in that. If I'm confronted over my behavior one way or another, or feel in a contentious situation like that, my go-to place is to be defensive. And in that place, I'm not hearing correctly. I'm lost in my own stuff, and whatever the individual that I'm confronting has to offer doesn't really even register. So I find for myself that one of the things I have to do is be real aware of, am I feeling defensive? Am I taking a defensive posture, or am I open to examining the situation?
And I look at it from I look at it from a slightly different perspective. Recently, I was introduced to this term deep listening. And I think part of the problem that we actually have is we don't listen in the way that we could listen. So I think it's partly what Snake is saying. From my perspective, it's also the way we hear people, listen to people, and the way we misinterpret what it is that they're saying. And I think that's part and parcel of why we become defensive. That's certainly why I become defensive. So I think that's very much part of it. This ability not to hear what the other person is saying because of our own internal framework or our own internal narrative.
Yeah, that's it, isn't it? Because I think we all know how it's supposed to work. You know, one admits one's own part in proceedings. One kind of hopes for the other to mirror that. And then you both kind of listen to each other once you're out of a place of defensiveness and work it out. But it doesn't always go like that. And sort of why not? And what does go wrong? And what can we do to rescue the situation?
Well, go ahead, Snake, and I'll follow on from you.
I'm kind of skipping to the end of the article, not that you need to read it at the moment, but conflict like that or rupture, like I said earlier, disrupts the status quo. So there's a sense of being ungrounded, uncertain, emotionally, we're not secure in that place. It's unfamiliar. And I think that calls for different reactions from different people. For some, they go to a shame place. For some, become a victim. For others, become defensive. There's a whole range of different emotions in reaction to that. But at the same time, my experience has been that it brings out the best of me. I think back to a relationship that I was in that ended poorly, and I was pretty heartbroken. And every day was a matter of, can I expand can my heart take it? Let's put it that way. And what I discovered out of that is that my heart was a lot more resilient than I gave it credit for. I was in a defensive, flinching sort of posture at that point in time and hadn't really given myself credit for being as resilient as I actually was. And that's fear in my book. I was afraid I wouldn't be able to make the shift, afraid that I was suffering a loss. Fear played into it for me in a big way. And when I'm in a fearful place, like Mike said earlier, I'm not listening, I'm not thinking, I'm reacting from an emotional place.
And we are afraid of being hurt even more than we already are?
Possibly. And I think in intimate relationships too, it's a compounding situation because there's all sorts of different micro insults, if you will, or hurts that accumulate along the way. And the tendency is to sweep them away and go forward, but they build up.
And so, certainly in relation to anger, Mike, can you talk about implications?
Let me develop on what Snake's talking about. So I did what was it? I think it was a little recording a couple of years ago, which I'm happy to send to everybody. But I was able to start breaking down what actually happens. So, for example, say I'm in a conversation with Snake, and it's just simply a conversation about, I don't know, the ice cream that we both eating. Yeah, and so I say, are you happy with the ice cream, Snake? And then Snake says something like, well, what do you mean, am I happy with the ice cream? And I say, well, it just tastes a bit weird. I mean, does yours taste a bit weird? And then he'll probably say something like, what do you mean weird? I mean, why are you suggesting that ice cream is weird? And then you see where this is going. And it's as simple as that. Me saying, well, why are you becoming so defensive, Snake? And then he'll say, well, I'm not being defensive. You can see where this is going, don't you? And it can start as simply a conversation, a simple conversation that I'm trying to have with Snake. And then before I know it, depending on his mood or his his feelings or his attitude or his behavior, because maybe he didn't sleep well last night, he might have had an argument with his wife, whatever it is. I have no idea what's going on in his internal world. And in fact, just talking about that in Brene Brown's most recent book called Atlas of the Heart, one of the quotes that she makes in one of her interviews, she says, we don't really know each other. And I'm thinking, oh my God, that is such a fascinating statement. We don't really know each other. So of course we make these assumptions about each other. So you can kind of see where this conversation could end up becoming an argument when all I'm doing is just kind of investigating if he's happy with the ice cream that he happens to be eating, because I'm not. But I have no real idea what might be going on for Snake. And then what happens as soon as he becomes defensive, what's his name? Daniel Goleman talks about contagious or contagion. So as soon as he becomes defensive, I start becoming defensive. And as soon as I start becoming defensive, he then becomes even more defensive. And before we know it, it turns into a slugfest. And, part of the challenge is, when I spoke earlier on about deep listening, there's something about really listening to hear what it is the person is saying, but to really, really hear what the person is saying. And if we don't understand what the person is saying, I think it's about curiosity. It's about exploring why they don't seem to understand what he's saying, and how can I say it in a way that they can hear me without becoming defensive or antagonistic in any particular way. And I think a lot of arguments start just like that. But of course, the challenge is coming back to what you're saying, Snake, is, how do we jump the curve? How can we find a way of de-escalating it before it gets out of control? And I think that's part of this idea of being curious as a starting point. There's something that's going on here that I had no intention for it to go on, and yet it's going on. So is this saying something about Snake? Is it saying something about me? Or, of course, is it saying something about us? The problem that most of us have, I'll make it about Snake, and I won't see my part in it. So that, for me, is part and parcel of, I think, what we're developing on here.
I think another big component in this whole rupture process is procrastination. How many of us have known something was foul in a relationship and refused to confront it? It's upsetting. I can ignore it. It'll be different tomorrow. But procrastination long beyond the point where something needs to be confronted and addressed. I think that makes the situation far worse. We tend to pick up the vibe of conflict long before we address it, and being proactive with that, not searching for a fight, but proactive when we feel some form of upset, and the ability to sit down and speak with one another is important.
So sorry, Snake, go ahead.
I once was in a relationship and went to a therapist because we were having trouble, and the therapist suggested that we designate a pillow. Whoever was holding that pillow got a chance to speak, and the other was obligated to listen, and just trade the pillow back and forth to have a conversation, because any other conversation ended up in conflict. My partner took the pillow and walked in the other room. It pretty much ended the conversation, and the pillow became a source of conflict. So how to slow that down and recognize when you're in a loop like that and disengage is an important part too, that fits with the procrastination.
Well, John Gottman, the relationship expert we mentioned earlier, he talks about impasse and gridlock, where things have got to a point where they seemingly cannot be repaired.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything we can do then? Because that's what a lot of kind of long-term dysfunctional relationships are gonna be like, right?
Mm.
So let me speak to that. So I do a lot of couples work. I do a huge amount of couples work, and the starting point for all of the couples work that I do, especially when it becomes confrontational, is educating and teaching my clients to stop, let me see if I can articulate this, is stop dismissing or invalidating the other person's experience. So even if I go back to the example that I gave with regards to snakes, so I ask him a very unprovocative question. Are you okay with your ice cream? And then he goes on to say, but why do you ask that? So of course I'm already noticing that I'm becoming defensive because he sounds defensive. And then of course I make some clumsy comment, well, I'm just asking. And why do you always react like that? And so at the point that I say something like that to Snake, he'll say, well, what do you mean react like that? I'm not reacting like that. And so there's something to be said about every time we dismiss or we negate somebody's experience or invalidate somebody's experience, whatever that experience is, that's, I think, the starting point for the rupturing. Because I do think there's something important that we isolate that moment where what is being said is either being misinterpreted or invalidated or assumed or projected. That's the starting point. And then from that moment on, how do we begin the process of slowing down the conversation so that we can both hear each other? So in a lot of my work, that is the starting point. That's the most critical component of having a healthy relationship, that we stop invalidating each other's experiences. And the other example I like to give in my workshops, where I say to Snake, I'm feeling cold. And he looks at me as if I'm nuts. What do you mean you're cold? How can you be cold? It's absolutely boiling. Now, what's interesting, Snake, what did you say, 30 degrees Fahrenheit, Snake? I don't even know what that is Celsius.
Much colder than that.
Much colder than that. Okay. And for me, he can deal with the cold. I can't deal with the cold. I'm sitting in 30 degrees Celsius. So of course we experience the temperature very differently. But when he says something like, well, what are you talking about? It's not cold at all. Or it's not hot at all. How can you be even talking about that? Already I feel like my experience is being validated. And that's that starting point of where we become confrontational, or we get into conflict, or we become defensive. And then the challenge is, how do we manage that? That's the key component to how do we manage when somebody invalidates or negates or dismisses our experience. And
one of the gateways into that too, I believe, is being curious. Part of that invalidation is, I don't understand. And so being curious about what goes on in another person's head and heart goes a long ways towards being open and less defensive. I don't have to accept that reality as mine, but accepting it as someone else's helps in a big way, just in terms of being able to open ears.
yeah,
That was very much my tactic with breaking bad news to people at work, that mostly they wanted to be heard rather than they wanted to win the argument, as it were.
Yeah.
And, if I can just reinforce what's being said there, I just want to give you this definition of deep listening, and I've put it up in the chat. Deep listening is a process of listening to learn. If you ain't listening, you ain't learning. If you ain't learning, you ain't listening. It requires the temporary suspension of judgment and the willingness to receive new information, whether pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And I just think it's just a fantastic definition of deep listening. Mm-hmm. So then there is something to be said about how deep you listen. Now, of course, us practitioners in the field of counseling and psychotherapy, we're trained to listen, and we train to listen deeply, and we spend most of our time listening. So often we're hearing things that other people aren't hearing. So it makes us very neutral, but also very objective, without any of the biases that actually go with listening to others. And so there is something to be said about the ability to slow down and really, really hear what it is the person is saying. And just reinforcing what you're saying, Snake, is this idea of being curious.
Mm-hmm. I think there's an additional piece of that too, is like so many things, it's a muscle. And if I look back at my own life, I've been involved in different things where I would get very intense feedback. Here's what you look like from the outside looking in, and no holds barred. And I benefited from that. And it scared the hell out of me to begin with because I felt judged. My own shame came up about my failings one way or another. But to receive that feedback became easier over time. I realized that if people gave me harsh feedback and I listened and learned from it, I didn't die. I wasn't ostracized. So that whole notion of being able to hear people say, here's what you look like from the outside looking in, is phenomenally powerful. I think another part that's been very valuable to me is there's an old saying about you spot it, you got it. A lot of the things that infuriate me about other people infuriate me because I have that characteristic. Being able to discern that if I'm triggered by some other person's behavior, I can usually find a tendril of that behavior in myself, and empathy grows out of that. Not sympathy, but a shared understanding.
So, Snake, what are we talking about? Are we talking about shadow projection, where we project onto each other? And the importance of being able to recognize that it's a projection, and if it's an accurate projection, be honest enough to own up to it, be vulnerable and authentic enough to own up to it.
I think that's part of it. If we're talking about repair or reconciliation, I think both of those things are important components, both the listening, the ability to take critique, as well as that ability to relate and empathize, validate another's experience, just like you say.
So let me just develop on that. So in my work, as some of you already know, because I recognize a few friendly faces, it's interesting because I had a conversation with a colleague of mine, a friend of mine in fact, one of my mentors last night. And the conversation went something like, well, if NATO had accepted Russia, when was it, 30 years ago, into NATO, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in. Therefore, it's Britain's fault or NATO's fault. And I responded by him saying, look, we're talking about 30 years ago. Why are we talking about fault? He said, well, that's where it started. I said, but that's irrelevant. But the point I'm wanting to make is that some of you already know that I've worked with and who know the material will also know that I'm very attached to moving from the realms of duality. Moving from the realms of duality, I'm right, you wrong, shut up. Where we get into talking about good, bad, right, wrong, my fault, your fault, and all the shoulds that go with that, which psychologically is termed as oppositional thinking. And so I said to this friend of mine, or this mentor of mine last night, I said, I don't do fault. He said, what do you mean you don't do fault? I said, I don't do fault. I'm not big into like, whose fault is it? Because at the end of the day, it's not about whose fault it is. It's all about repair. It's all about respecting each other's differences, agreeing to disagree, or it's okay to have a different opinion. And so for me, there's something to be said that if we can move away from what is called the either or paradigm and embrace the both and paradigm, which is agreeing to disagree, which is to be able to say to somebody, it's okay to have a different opinion, or to at least say, I hear what it is you're saying. I don't necessarily agree with what you're saying, but it's your point of view, and that needs to be respected. That's one of the ways, Steve, that I see as jumping the curve, coming back to, how do you work with an impasse? Mm-hmm. And it's not easy to do that simply because our egos get in the way. Because one of the things about our egos, we love to be right. It's part of the human condition. And if we can find a way of being able to agree to disagree, or it's okay to have a different opinion, that in itself can be profoundly transformative.
And can that work in families, Mike, when you've got 4 or 5 of them? Maybe there's a dynamic between the parents and the children and vice versa. How do you make it work with a family?
Well, is that a question to me or to?
To yourself. Yeah.
Oh, look, first of all, doing battle with a teenager ain't going to cut it because they'll always win. That's just the nature of what it means to be a teenager. But I think there is something to be said if they're much younger, where we do what we can as parents to at least give them the space and the opportunity to make sense of what it is that we're saying and respecting their point of view and creating a dialogue out of it rather than just saying no. And I remember when I was a kid, my father would say no. And I'd say, but why do you say no? He says, because I say no, because I said so. Mm-hmm. So there's something about how quick we are to dismiss children and how we dismiss the child's experience, which of course creates resentment. So what do they do with that resentment? They beat up their brothers or sisters, or they find an opportunity to irritate us. And as soon as we ourselves get angry, it means that they've won. But I don't know if that was answering your question, Steve. I might have gone off at a bit of a
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I was just, thinking how we can apply these things, which are quite sort of equal to equal, as it were, and introduce a sort of a wider group of people of different ages and maybe different relationship dynamics.
I want to say too that it's good to remind everybody that, in conflict like this, in rupture, is an emotionally charged place to be and difficult. So there aren't magic bullets like just be forgiving, just listen, and it'll all be okay. It still is going to sting like hell to move through that. And particularly in a family, you've got 3-4 people that are at each other and have a habit of being at each other. It's monumental emotionally to park that enough to be able to reconcile. So it's no small feat to be able to do this. It's not like flipping a switch. It takes humility, like Michael says. It takes being able to deal with the ego, a sense of being hurt, or in my own case, being phenomenally defensive because I'm right. It really takes the best of us as human beings to put the brakes on, and those emotional brakes oftentimes are smoking by the time we ask for help.
Got quite scared of your angry face there.
But I tell you, I had I've been dying to say this to this group because I had a real learning recently around one-upmanship, and there was a really transformative moment in my relationship with my girlfriend, because one of the things I've noticed, and I've done it most of my life, is, if I go back to this example that I was giving early on with Snake and the ice cream. So let me see if I can come up with an example in relation to that example. So, I say to Snake, well, are you okay with the ice cream? Does it taste okay? And he'll say something like, yeah, why? What's wrong with the ice cream? And then I say, well, it's not that there's anything wrong with it. It just tastes a bit weird. And then he'll say, but Michael, what are you going on? What are you going on about? And then of course I start becoming defensive, and I say to him, well, what are you going on about? And then he'll say, well, you always do this. And I say, do what? You see where this is going. So then he'll say, well, you're always moaning, because that's one of my big bugbears when somebody says you're always, you never, why aren't you? But there's something about it as it starts to escalate. I'll say, but you know what? What are you talking about? I'm always moaning. You're always moaning as well. And that's one-upmanship. And then where do we go with that? Mm-hmm. It almost nips the argument or the opportunity for reconciliation in the bud.
So it's like straight on to I'm not the problem, you're the problem.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then in a way, we just cancel each other out. But where do we go with that? So that becomes a resentment that we both carry. And one of the things I've noticed, certainly in my relationship, the turning point for me in my relationship was recognizing how often I do that. It would be as simple as, you always say that. What do you mean I always say that? You always say that. Well, where do we go with that? And so I've realized that I've been doing the one-upmanship thing my whole life. I cannot remember a time in my life when I didn't do the one-upmanship. And just recognizing that has transformed the quality of my relationship. And when I'm about to say it, I've got to contain myself and I've got to sit in the discomfort of my feelings, even though I'm dying to say it. And I know there have been times I've said, you know what I want to say is I want to say something which is about one-upmanship, but I'm not going to say it, but that's how I feel. So as Snake was saying, it's not an immediate process of being able to reconcile or to find a way of empathizing with the other person or even listening to them. It takes time to do this. And I think it's a real fine art to be able to do that.
There's a common dynamic that I see a lot too with couples is oftentimes the man needs time to process, to figure out what his emotions are telling him. And a break oftentimes helps. Whereas oftentimes the feminine in that relationship experiences that break as abandonment, disengagement. And it, of course, can shift. It's not a male or female type of thing, but this dynamic around hang in there till it's fixed versus take a break, let things cool down. People need to establish somewhat how that works for them. A good example of that is my wife and I have made peace with the fact of that dynamic. And so we'll reach a point in a disagreement where we're far enough in that I say, I need 10 minutes. And we've already established a foundation of, I'll be back. This isn't abandonment. It's giving me the time to cool down so I can think clearly. And those types of patterns take time to develop. They're highly personal to each relationship. And again, rest on the foundation of being able to listen, being able to de-escalate, being able to recognize defensiveness and park it for a moment. So this is a whole skill set that can be learned along the way if we're aware that it even exists. Well, it's part of why I tried to stress in the article that we're not going to avoid rupture, and we're always going to be required to repair something. And so this dynamic is so pervasive in our lives, best to get familiar with it. And familiar not only at a cultural level or relationship, but within ourselves as individuals. How do I react when I experience rupture? And what tools do I have at my disposal to effect repair?
So, Snake, I think that's really kind of fundamental to the conversation we're having, which is that cooling down period, which I can say a lot about. What Harville Hendricks talks about is anger by appointment only. So you never want to actually do a clearing. You never want to have the conversation if you're carrying resentment and you know that actually it's going to turn into a dogfight. Mm-hmm. But I had an incident recently, which is really fresh for me, is I had an issue came up between one of my best friends and myself. And I don't want to go into the detail of it, but what happened is it got a little hot and I made a decision to pack my bags. I was staying with him, pack my bags and leave because it just wasn't, I didn't feel very comfortable even trying to talk to him, simply because at any point that I tried to have a conversation with him, he became defensive. And that doesn't really cut it with me. If somebody is not able to hear what it is that I'm saying and respect what it is that I have to say and cuts me off, that's not the kind of relationship or friendship that I want to have. Anyway, he did text me, and what was interesting in the conversation, the text that he sent me is he invited me to his birthday party, which was just a couple of days ago. And I said, look, I think at this point, I need a cooling off period. That's what I said. Those are the words. I need a cooling off period. I really need to think about my relationship with you. And then as I started to reflect on what kind of relationship I want to have, I then wrote to him and I said, okay, so this is the deal. These are my boundaries and you need to respect them. One is, I don't want to be criticized by you. I don't want to be patronized by you. I don't want to be psychoanalyzed by you. And I don't want to be pathologized by you. And on the basis of that, I can continue my relationship with you. And his response was very interesting. So I'd like to read it. He said, I've heard all you have to say and decided that I'll go with your suggestion. The friendship is over, which he's very clear about. Now, by the very nature of who he is, he's one of those individuals who needs time to really think about it. But I think there is something to be said about, if we want to sustain a healthy relationship, the people that we're in relationship with need to respect our boundaries. And of course, I need to respect his boundaries, or we need to respect each other's boundaries. Because if we don't respect each other's boundaries, as most of you already know, that's where conflict also arises. So I can say to somebody, please don't do that. I'm not comfortable with that. And if they keep doing that, how do I manage that? What do I do about that? How many times do I need to say to that person, please stop doing that. I'm not comfortable with that. Or please stop criticizing me, or please stop telling me off. And if the person keeps doing that, it's very easy in a friendship. But what happens if you're in an intimate relationship and you've got 10 kids under the age of 10? Mm-hmm. How do you manage that? How do you jump the curve?
Yeah.
But coming back to what you were saying, Snake, earlier on, sometimes I've noticed in previous relationships that people never apologize. So for example, Steve, something that you were talking about earlier on, especially in relation to our kids, how many times do parents apologize to their kids? How many parents apologize to their kids? I think as a child while growing up, I don't think I was apologized to once. Not once. And with the parents that I've worked with over many, many years, most parents have never apologized to their kids. That's why they're doing anger management. Mm-hmm. But there's something to be said by starting to apologize. The other thing that's important, as you were saying earlier on, Snake, is about forgiveness. Please forgive me. I dropped the ball. I messed up. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, what you're also talking about is this ability to empathize. Mm-hmm. So there is something to be said about setting healthy boundaries, not controlling boundaries, but healthy boundaries, so that you can feel safe, so that I can feel safe. Mm-hmm. But if I set a healthy boundary and somebody keeps crossing it, of course, what it creates is mistrust. And wherever there's mistrust, there's fragmentation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'd add to that too, is that fulcrum. I don't know about jumping the curve, but that fulcrum for me has been, am I willing? Am I willing to be vulnerable? Am I willing to look at myself? Am I willing to listen? Certainly I've hit relationships where I've asked myself that question and I've said, no, I'm not willing. And like the example you're using, Michael, with your friend, there are relationships that end. And knowing that rather than torturing each other and confronting it is, as hard as it is, a benevolent act for both parties. Some relationships need to shift dramatically or end. And that's just a reality of it. We're not able to walk off and everything be rainbows and unicorns all the time. And even in those moments, I think that ability, that question, am I willing? Willing to do what? Willing to put down my hurt, my shame for a moment? Willing to confront that somehow I've made a grievous insult in some way or another and need to make amends for that. Key to this whole willing thing feels like real deep vulnerability. Feels like not winning. And I think it's the converse of that it actually is willing. And a critical part of the de-escalation is not to surrender, give in, or be a doormat, but at the same time, recognizing that there comes a time where the answer may be, I'm simply not willing. And it comes from a heartfelt place. This is not a compatible or doable situation. It's sad, and it's part of the reality as well.
So I tell you what, I'm interested in getting some feedback from some of the participants. I'm curious about other people's views and their thoughts and feelings about the conversation that we're having.
This is Cole in San Jose, California. I just read an article on loneliness, and that fits into the work I do in emergency response up in the fires around us here in the Northern California area. And one of the choices in being alone is having to leave a caustic relationship, much like what Mike was saying about choosing clearly to leave a relationship that just isn't working. And the loneliness article was about that being a real killer as far as other means. And I just thought that was a tie-in and leaving a caustic relationship. I built 4 women's shelters for battered women, and we would have them in a safe place, but they would so often feel comfortable in a rough place that was familiar than a new place which was unfamiliar. And so it's just a concern, and I unfortunately have to jump. So I'm really going to be back and join you guys and hopefully listen more. I really appreciate this time for our home and those that I touch. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Cole.
you.
Let's go. Anybody else want to comment? Thoughts, feelings, observations? What about a comment from some of the women?
I think for me, it's not quite developed yet, so forgive me if it's not going to come out well, but what stops me from talking to somebody about why I'm hurt, for example, is because of a fear of hurting their feelings or noticing something in somebody else that if I did tell them. So for example, my mom is jealous of me, for example. So I wouldn't tell her because I didn't want to hurt her feelings. So there's that resentment that builds and builds and builds. And I'll never be able to tell her because I don't want to hurt her. So it's still ruptured and the repair never gets resolved. So I struggle with that.
Yeah.
Another case of
What
YouTube.
I hear in that too, Dial, is your response to a situation like that is empathetic. Not right or wrong, just it comes from an empathic sort of place. You feel for your mother, so you don't want to hurt her.
But I do pay the price of feeling angry.
Yes.
It's both together.
Right.
Yeah.
And oftentimes that polarity shows itself in a lot of our emotions, a lot of our emotional responses.
Yeah.
I have a different view to your view, Snake, and the theoretical term is projective identification. And I think I might have mentioned this before to some of you. So what often happens, okay, so let me using it as an example again, Snake. So Snake says something really unkind to me. Now, I'm not comfortable expressing my anger, and I know that if I express my anger towards Snake, and he's very vulnerable and he's very fragile, I think, well, oh my God, if somebody had to be angry with me and I'm in Snake's shoes, well, I don't think he would manage it. So what happens is that I don't say anything. But the problem is I suck it in relation to Snake because I don't know whether he'll be able to deal with it or not. But I suck it in, and then of course I dump it on somebody else, whether it's a stranger or whether it's a loved one who I believe will take it or can take it. And so, what you're saying, Diala, is being in a really difficult place because if it means that you're turning your anger in on yourself,
Yeah, and it turns into shame.
Exactly. I see that as really unhealthy. But the problem is projective identification is really what limits us in terms of being able to speak our truth. So the challenge, of course, is it's not what we say, it's how we say it. And often in my couples work, I say that to them. What you're saying is okay, but it's the way that you're saying it. It's the tone of your voice. It's the language that you use. So the challenge is, how can I communicate with somebody in a way that they'll be receptive to hearing me? And that in itself, as some of you know, is the art.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Marshall Rosenberg is the master of nonviolent communication. So those of you who are not familiar with Marshall Rosenberg's work, I would encourage you to read his book called Nonviolent Communication. But there is something to be said about how do I say it in a way that a person can hear it? But of course, I have to say it from a vulnerable place. That's how I have to say it. So if I can just, how do I say this? If I can just role play that, not necessarily with you, but if I was in your position, knowing that your mother might take offense or your mother might become aggressive back.
No, it's not. I don't think she would go like that. I think she will. I just don't know if it's helpful for me to say to her, you are jealous of me. I don't think it's helpful for her self-esteem. I don't, but I pay the price because I feel ashamed around her for my whatever it might be.
Okay, so are you okay if I just
sure.
tell you how one of the ways that you could potentially say it? Because this is part of the repair component. So and of course I'm not you and you know your mother, but there is something about how do I bring all of who I am to the conversation. So I start the conversation by saying, Mum, I want to say something to you, but I am so frightened that you might misinterpret what I'm saying. And the last thing I want you to do is to misinterpret what I'm saying or to take offense. But actually, it's really important for me to say this because it has a really negative and a profound negative effect on me. And the challenge that I have is I don't really know how to language it. So I might come across as really clumsy, but that's also because I'm frightened and I'm scared about what your response might be. In fact, what I'm probably most scared of is that you might reject and abandon me, and I couldn't live with that. That's the starting point. So you prepared her for it. Now, I'm not sitting here suggesting it's going to work. That's not what I'm suggesting. But there is something, and some of you might know the work of Fritz Perls, where he does chair work. Are you familiar with that, Diala?
No.
Chair work in Gestalt. And so what you do is you have your mother sitting there in an empty chair, and you start the conversation with her, just like you started the conversation with us. And then you switch chairs, and you become your mother, and you respond like your mother, like you think your mother might respond. And then you switch chairs again, and then you respond to your mother. And then you switch chairs, and you respond as your mother towards yourself. You're familiar with this process, aren't you, Snake?
Right.
Chair work. Yes. Is anybody else familiar with chair work? It's based on Gestalt practices. And so eventually you get to what I would even describe as a paradox, is that you realize that actually that you'll begin to realize why you're so afraid to share it with your mother. And it's not because she might not be able to handle it. It's because of your fear of the way that you might present it or represent it. And as you do this chair work, it becomes transformative, or you gain insight about what's actually driving your anxiety and fear. So it might be something that you want to explore or look at or play around with your therapist, or even in your group therapy might be useful to do.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Now, the real benefit to that too is multi-pronged in that by assuming the role in your imagination of your mother's reaction, empathy grows, better understanding. But even more important, it pops that bubble where it's all in your head. By verbalizing, you get it out of just running around in your head over and over again, and takes some of that cycling away. but it is a valuable exercise to really inhabit the role of the person you're in conflict with, even if it's in your own imagination. The chair work makes it physical from the standpoint of there's an actual separation, but it is a valuable thing to do.
I always get a bit stuck when I'm dealing with somebody who I think is just going to thrive on the drama of a conversation like that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one thing when you think that the other person is going to respond well to the repair attempts. But how about when you think you're just getting drawn into another conflab that's just for the sake of, energy or negative attention or one of these? What should we do? Should we still attempt? Should we make the repair attempt for our own sake? In the same way you've just explained to Diala that it might be worth it?
It's a case by case type of thing too, because it depends totally on the situation. Is it one like Michael described with his friend where reconciliation in the moment today is not possible and so you go apart? Or is it something internal like Diala talks about, her fear of her mother's reaction? Or there's countless different situations, and that's where the self-knowledge comes in. Are you willing, and do you have the tools? But it's sad to say, kind of a crapshoot and situation by situation.
In my chair work, I'd say my fear was getting angry with them and going nuclear. Yes. Sorry, Mike.
Yes, but I'm just thinking about that what's at risk technique, Snake.
Yeah.
Even that what's at risk technique with the yellow could also be very, very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
What's that risk? It's called?
It's called what's at risk, but the yellow, I would suggest that you do it offline unless you really want to do it here.
Yeah.
Maybe if you're suggesting offline, then it's offline.
Well, I mean, you might want to do it offline. You don't necessarily have to do it offline because I think it will be useful for everybody, but it's your call, of course.
It's worth introducing that though, briefly, without focusing specifically on Diala's situation. But if you imagine that thing that you're most afraid to confront and ask yourself the question, well, what's the real risk? And oftentimes what it comes down to is pretty basic stuff. It's oftentimes feels like, well, I'm screwed if I do, I'm screwed if I don't. There are 2 options, 3 options, none of them good. But exploring that and asking yourself, well, what's really at risk? I'll be abandoned, I'll be whatever. You get kind of at the root cause, but it's a simple enough process. And, what's at risk if I take this action? Really, what am I afraid of? And oftentimes it comes down to these paradoxes that we encounter often in life, which is I'm damned if I do, I'm damned if I don't. And at that point, action is about the only way to break it. Right action, wrong action, but action moves it along. But that really identifies too what Diala put on the table in terms of, I'm afraid this is in me and it's having an impact on me. The what's at risk question at a personal level can illuminate that to a certain degree.
Can it be I'm afraid to hurt the person and I'm afraid to be abandoned at the same time?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's like, what's at risk? And generally it's an emotional risk.
But also what you've just done there is you've also identified the paradox.
Mm-hmm.
That just give us that example again, Diala.
That I'm afraid to hurt the person, but I'm afraid to be abandoned at the same time.
And that's the paradox. I'm afraid to be I'm afraid to hurt the person, but I'm also afraid to be abandoned at the same time. That's the risk.
And there's a not often spoken about, but I wouldn't be surprised that you're feeling it right now. Can you feel that in your body somewhere?
Mm.
It doesn't reconcile it entirely. It doesn't, solve the problem. But oftentimes that damned if I do, damned if I don't ends up with a real physical, emotional response that is helpful, maybe uncomfortable, but helpful to know where the heat is.
Yeah, I carry it all in my back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I've been asking people lately, where in your body do you carry your grief? And I've gotten responses from the top of their heads to their feet in terms of where people carry their grief. And I've been curious about that. I mean, obviously, a lot say heart, lungs, throat, stomach, a lot of the predictable ones, but face, legs. And what it is this autonomic nervous system, the vagal nerve, that communicates through emotion and throughout our body. So, of course, we would feel these emotions in different parts of our body. That vagal nerve is the feeling nerve that communicates with the brain, and it runs throughout our entire body. And so, particularly if we're talking about rupture and repair, that autonomic nervous system is one that comes into play in a big way. And unfortunately, we're not educated to be aware of it or finesse it or deal with it in a particular way, yet all of us carry that as part of our system.
Can I just say something?
Absolutely.
I'm a psychodynamic therapist, and I'm listening to this with great interest. I was wondering, the idea of mums and daughters' jealousy is a very frequent one, and I've been both a daughter and a mum, so I've seen it from both sides, But I'm interested because there must be some behaviour that the mum exhibits, which makes our client, we call her, aware of this feeling of jealousy. So an option is for her to address the behaviours if she wants to. Mum, I've always wondered why you always, and I've noticed things like that. That's a sort of a way into drawing out the mum without actually addressing, I think you're jealous of me. Because I've got a nasty feeling the first thing that would happen, even with a good approach, might be that the mum will say, no, of course I'm not, because it's not an acceptable thing. I don't know. I just put it out there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, is it Mary, Margaret?
Marion.
Marion, I'm ever so sorry.
Yeah,
Thank you,
yeah.
Marion, for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a real valid comment. And, there's also, whether it's a son and a father, a son and a mother, or daughter and mother, that dynamic is incredibly complex in many, many different ways. I remember years ago, in the southern United States is a very different culture than the one that I live in the Midwest. And one of the dynamics that I kept seeing was this power struggle between sons and fathers. And one of the southern men explained to me, you have to understand that a man isn't fully a man until he takes his father out in the street and physically beats him in a fight.
Okay.
Until then, your name is Jimmy Bob or Johnny Ray. You have a little boy's name until you're able to establish dominance over your father.
No
Now,
wonder
I'm
everyone's moving to Texas.
making a gross generalization by attaching that to the southern United States, but boy, that's a common dynamic that I see all over the place, and it's real. How do we move past the influence of our parents? Oftentimes is a lifelong endeavor because of the phenomenal influence they've had on us.
And Robert Bly suggests that a son only becomes a man when his father dies.
Yeah.
Which of course I don't fully support, but I think for some men that's really significant. Or a woman only becomes a woman when her mother dies.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand the concept, but I find it difficult to embrace.
Yeah.
And I think it might be true for some men and women for that matter.
Yeah.
So listen, I'm aware of time. Any other comments or questions or thoughts or observations? Steve, did you have anything that you wanted to add to this?
Well, I'd read about this this thing called splitting, which is a very modern take on rupture and repair, where we divide people into either completely untrustworthy and therefore not worth bothering repairing, or absolutely trustworthy and therefore we will never have to repair with them. Ergo, we can write personal conflict out of our lives. So it's like blocking people on your mobile phone. How would you persuade someone that this approach would not serve them? But what can you tell people about why is rupture and repair worth doing?
Well, it depends who the individual is, but I just want to come to it from a slightly different angle. I'm very aware that while growing up, I used to reject before being rejected. I used to abandon before being abandoned. I don't tend to do that anymore because I've grown up, I believe. That's one component, but there's another component is getting people to reject me. And what I mean by that is constantly testing their love. And so, the question you're raising, Steve, from my perspective, is a really significant question, because if I revisit the example I gave with my recent incident with my best friend, this is not the first time this has happened. This is not the second time this has happened. So I don't give it a lot of energy at this point, because I know that in a couple of weeks or maybe in a couple of months, I'll get a text message from him, or I'll get an email from him, or I'll get a call from him, and he'll want to reconcile. The question is, would I really want to reconcile this time? That's the question I ask myself. If he had to call me, would I want to reconcile and make up?
Mm-hmm.
I'm ambivalent about that right now. And of course, in the next 10 weeks or 15 weeks or even 5 weeks, I can change my mind. But I do think that within the context of the question that you're asking, there's something to be said about what's in it for me. What's in it for the other person? And I think those are very significant and important questions.
Mm.
Well, the Buddha tells us that we don't exist, and it is only with our relations with other people that we define ourselves, define our lives.
Well, he also says there's no such thing as a self, if that's what you mean.
I want to go back to Steve's question for a minute, because the splitting is a bit black and white for me. And I end up seeing a lot more gray in my life. So I prefer to see that as a bookshelf. And there's a hierarchy of people I can trust or not trust, and a gradient. So there are people that I can sort of trust most of the time. They're kind of in the middle. People I can't trust at all. They're on the top shelf where I don't have to reach often. And there's people that I can trust. And so it tends to flow on a spectrum for me. I hate to just cut people off because they constantly surprise me. People that I may have written off changed as I change, situations change. And so maybe I'm an optimist at heart, but I prefer doing a spectrum in terms of how I organize that, rather than the black and white of you're in or you're out.
So that does come back to empathy.
Mm-hmm.
It does come back to being bigger than the situation itself. It does come back to making sure that your ego's out the way.
Yeah.
And
it commits you to setting very rigid boundaries, which is a lot of damn work.
And being clear as well, I think, Mike, was one thing you taught me that benefited challenging repair jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Is that sometimes the more one beats around the bush, the more one tries to be diplomatic. Often the more sort of energy you just create between the two of you.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're better off giving it to people politely, absolutely, and compassionately, but as straight as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what oftentimes doesn't get spoken, I mean, Minnesotans, where I live in Minnesota, one of the labels that gets put is that we're very passive aggressive. And it's actually what you just described. It's a fear of having that confrontation, yet we feel it at an emotional level. You know when someone's being passive aggressive, you can feel it in your body. But I think that differs all over the world. Not that passive aggressive doesn't fit in different places, but it definitely is true in the culture I live in. People are far too nice to be confrontive. And so there's all this crap floating under the radar.
And also, Snake, I mean, in the work of John Lee says, people who people who tend to be passive aggressive are the individuals who have feared to be rejected or abandoned.
Mm-hmm.
And what he says is only one person who can reject and abandon you, and that is yourself.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about a child or a teenager. I'm talking about a mature adult. Mm-hmm. And I also notice is that when I don't speak my truth and I don't set the healthy boundaries I need to set myself, I am actually out of integrity with myself, not with the other person, but with myself. So for me, what is really important is to be brave enough to set healthy boundaries. And I want to emphasize the word healthy boundaries because I know what is healthy for me. But if somebody doesn't want to respect that boundary, what is in question is the integrity of the relationship. And it's about how can I communicate? And I think this is part of the repair. How can I communicate from a place of vulnerability rather than from a place of defensiveness? You never, why don't you, you should, what's wrong with you, and that's really bad. How can I start that conversation? How can I find the courage to find the conversation and start the conversation with, I feel sad and angry and scared and hurt. And I don't know how to approach this subject because I'm afraid of how you might react and respond. And I don't want to lose you as a friend, or I don't want to lose you as a lover. But right now I'm struggling. And in the great words of Brene Brown, it is about how we bring vulnerability to those conversations, because that's where our power really lies, in our vulnerability.
Some of this stuff takes on a life of its own too. A recent example, I had a close friend, 20 years ago. We've had no contact for 20 years. And I never knew why. I felt like I had offended him in some way, and he just disappeared. He reached out last week and we reconnected, and I asked him directly, I said, did I do something to offend you? You just disappeared. It had nothing to do with me. I've carried that for 20 years. Why I didn't reach out at some point and ask that question in 20 years. And, we had a wonderful conversation, and I felt the relief of, oh, yeah, it wasn't me after all. He went on with his life in a different direction. It took him away from me. But 20 years, really?
So are we concerned about appearing, and I know we've got to wrap it up, and maybe this is the last one, but are we so concerned about being awkward or needy or causing a scene?
Vulnerable, Steve. We're concerned about being vulnerable.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what we're concerned about. That's our fear.
No, oh, sorry, Amanda.
I just wanted to tell a little story because I thought it was a nice way to wrap up this super interesting conversation. I had an opportunity. It's also about context, right? And I had an opportunity recently my ex and I finished our marriage in a quite nasty fashion. And I had an opportunity recently because I felt extremely sick, and he came over to see me because he was worried about me, and he had a fight with his girlfriend about it, and she suggested a temporary split up. And so he came and lived with me for 2 weeks. And it was just the most incredible context, because he was being super kind and looking after me, and I was looking after him because he was worried about his relationship. And it was really just a moment of reparation of all the nastiness at the end of our marriage. And it was just such a beautiful occurrence, like a gift from the gods, you know, of just an opportunity that we both seized to be kind to each other, and empathetic, and show each other that facet of our personalities that we'd hidden from each other for such a long time.
Wow.
That's a great place to end, because it makes the point of what we've been talking about is this kind of crap in our lives really brings out the best in people if we have our eyes open. That's a beautiful story.
Fantastic, Amanda. I'm so glad to hear that. I'm so glad you shared that with us. Beautiful. So there's hope, huh? Amazing. Very touching. Yeah, I think I said all I need to say at this point, and it's been great hanging out with you all. It's nice to see new faces, nice to see old faces.
In that case, the next Wisdom Track podcast is planned for Saturday, the 19th of March, where we're talking about sex and anger. There's some clickbait for the YouTube channel. Sign up to our newsletter to keep abreast of that at angermanaged.co.uk. You can also find us on Instagram and Facebook. Our next introductory evening, where you can get a flavour of the British Association of Anger Management's courses, plus pick up on some fundamental skills, is on Thursday, March the 10th at 7 p.m. Plus, we have our online group course, as seen in the Sunday Times and lots of other places, starting on Tuesday, the 15th of March. And we have an in-person weekend group course taking place just outside London from the 25th to the 27th of March. If you've got something out of the Wisdom Track podcast, please smash that like button. Subscribe to, and please leave a comment if you can. Doesn't have to be a funny one. Doesn't have to be an intelligent one, right? Doesn't have to be the top comment or anything like that. Just has to say, awesome, thank you guys, well done, or something like that, because it really helps get the podcast message out there to people who may also benefit. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody. Thank you very, very much for joining us today and giving such sterling contributions. And we will see you next month. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.